For participating in the survey. I really appreciate it. And if you're a visitor, thank you for bearing with us for that brief moment. If you are visiting with us, welcome once again to Pakenham Church. We're a little bit light on today. I think we've got a few families away, but it's good to have you here. I feel like we have the core Pakenham family here when I look across the room. So it's good to have you all here with us. Who's got their air-conditioned timers set for when they get home? It's going to be, 32, 33 degrees today. I was in Mansfield this week with the pastors of our conference here in Victoria, and it was forecasted to be 17, 18 degrees. And I said to Emma, how should I pack for this? And I packed really warm, but I found it was a warm 17, 18 degrees. You guys feel that this week? I don't know. So I'm feeling this is going to be a warm summer, and just get ready for it. We are going to continue today. We are on the home stretch, guys, of our time in the book of Acts, and there's still actually quite a lot of ground to cover. But today we are actually going to cover the majority of the last quarter of the book of Acts. Acts you can break up into, depending how you want to read it, you could break it up into thirds, you could break it up into quarters, and if you break it up into quarters, one quarter is focused on a particular experience of Paul. But I want you, I'm going to share something, and it's not meant to be political in nature. It's just an observation, but I'm sure everybody has opinions. But I just could not shake off the recent elections as I was writing this sermon, particularly the build-up to the election in America. That's what I'm talking about. And whether you, we're Australians, right? But whether you were somebody who, was a Democrat supporter or a Republican supporter, it was very clear that the Department of Justice, the DOJ, had a purpose in putting Donald Trump in the stand, right? They wanted to check this guy out. They wanted to scrutinize his life. And again, I'm not here to make a comment if that was the right thing, if it was the wrong thing. Seemed to help his cause, if I'm honest with you. But the guy goes through so many trials, right? He's trying to do a political campaign, and, for a while he's just in New York trying to do these rallies because he has to go to the courthouse every other week or every other day. I share that because it's the closest thing that I could see to what the Apostle Paul went through. Yeah? So not meant to be any commentary on whether it was the right thing or wrong thing, but just imagine if you were Trump, just going in and out of court all the time. This is the life of Paul in the closing quarter of the book of Acts. Luke literally spends the majority of the final quarter looking at how the Apostle Paul would be in and out of different trial settings. Graham, if we can bring up that first slide, that would be really great. I just want you to see this, okay? There is literally trial after trial after trial. Have a look up on the screen. So we have in Acts 21, and we kind of got to Acts 21 in our last message, but there's a trial by the crowd. It's not an official trial. I'm just using that word as a kind of placeholder, but Paul's in front of the crowd trying to defend his faith. And as soon as he mentions the word Gentile, everybody has a fit and they want to kill him. Later, he'll have a trial by the Sanhedrin. Okay, so this is not the Jewish crowd, but it's the Jewish leaders. And he'll go in front of the Jewish leaders. Next, he will have a trial by the governor of the area, Governor Felix. I really like the name Felix, by the way. I almost named one of my children Felix. But Felix, he gets trialed by Felix. Felix will finish his role as the governor and leaves Paul in prison for 2 years. And then Festus comes along. What a name. Imagine calling your child Festus. Festus. Festus is the new governor, and he talks to Paul, checks him out, and then Festus brings Paul to King Agrippa. Agrippa, he's from the Herod family, as in Herod who's trying to kill baby Jesus. It's his, great relative. So King Agrippa will, check Paul out, and then I've put this it's not exactly a trial, but Paul's word on his trip to Rome. Paul's word will be tested by the Roman centurion who's meant to be his guard all the way there. And you'll see on his trip to Malta, Auntie Mary, I have to look at you when I say Malta. We've got our very own Maltese person here, okay? On his way to the island of Malta, this centurion, he sort of trusts Paul, but he'll take the word of everybody else. Paul is scrutinized all throughout this trip, this final quarter. And it's such a huge body of the book of Acts, and it's often the part we look over. In blue, I've put in Acts ? Because we just don't have the chapter. We just don't know if he gets a trial by Nero. But Luke wants you to know very clearly that there will be moments as a Christian. In the book of Acts, there are templates of things Christians will experience, right? And Luke wants you to know that Christians will be scrutinized. Can you see that? I mean, that's so clear to me. Christians will be scrutinized. Christians will be checked out. People will look at you under a microscope. They are looking at you in your workplace. Your family are checking you out if you're a widow. Christians are being checked out all the time. And Paul wants you to see it. Luke wants you to see it. And there are so many things that we can glean from Paul's experience being put under the microscope. I think the thing we see here, there's a couple of big things that I really want to draw out. But what does it look like to be a committed follower of Jesus when you're being this closely scrutinized? And what are the opportunities for a believer when you are going through this kind of scrutiny? Those are the two big things I'd like to draw out. Now, I do want to do a little bit of a recap from where we came in the last message, for those of you who weren't here. But we saw that Paul had a strong urge, as this Holy Spirit unction. You need to go to the city of Jerusalem. And whilst he's feeling this strong, impression, he's also getting strong warnings that your life is in major danger if you go here. But he feels like he needs to go. And what we saw was that the reason Paul felt that he needed to go was this unity. He wanted to bring the Christian church into unity, the Jewish Christians and the Gentile Christians into a place of unity. But the whole thing falls apart at the seams. And we pick up where this story left off. I have another slide that I want to show you because I think it's really important. We know that Acts is written by Luke, but so is the Gospel of Luke. And the similarities between Jesus and Paul as they head to Jerusalem are incredible. And again, I think Paul, just so you know where we're going with this, Paul wants you to know that if you Jesus wants you to know, Luke wants you to know, if you follow Jesus, you are likely to follow him in a similar way that he ended his life. Some really serious things to wrestle with. So let's just have a look. Similarities between Paul and Jesus. And we could have done a whole sermon on this, but we just don't have the time. They both make a decision to journey to Jerusalem. Maybe you'll remember our sermon on that last year. They are both welcomed gladly upon arrival. Jesus is welcomed as this king, and there's this whole triumphal entry. Paul is welcomed very, very well by that church. They are both arrested in the city of Jerusalem whilst they are praying. Okay? Jesus on the Mount of Olives, Paul's gone to the temple to pray. They are arrested doing something spiritual, talking to God. There is an intent to kill them. Their trials begin in front of a Jewish audience, but they are both eventually handed over to Romans. Can you see the similarities? It's pretty fascinating. I've got one more slide of these similarities. Okay, let's go to the next one. They both appear before Roman governors. No guilt is found in either men. They are sentenced to scourging, like beating with whips. It's pretty gross. If you want to get a pretty close depiction, you could watch The Passion of Christ, although I wouldn't recommend it. Both defend the resurrection. I've highlighted that in blue because that's a very important point that we need to look at towards the end of our time together. They both have an audience with the king and both willing to give their life for the gospel. Okay? That should say both willing, not both willingly, but yeah, they are both willing to lay their lives down. Luke wants you to see that Paul is following in the footsteps of Jesus. The trials, the experience of Jesus, these are all things that come part and parcel with following Jesus. Now, we are largely inoculated from all of this stuff, living in the West, living in a free society. But I can tell you guys, there are people who go through this experience every single day. Would you agree with me? There are people in other parts of the world who are dealing with this constantly. And so I was just thinking to myself, is it worth sharing this because we live in Melbourne and it's, for the moment, it's safe. We have freedom to gather, freedom to worship. But I think there's a timely reminder. You know, we are people who believe that Jesus is coming soon, amen? And I think it doesn't matter what part of the world you live in, Christians will go through this experience at one point in time or another. And so I was sharing with Shenando, I'm a bit sometimes reluctant to go to these heavier topics. But Scripture Luke really wants us to see this, don't you think? He really wants us to see these similarities. And if he really wants us to see these similarities, then I think we have to wrestle with this together, okay? So these themes come through very strongly in Luke's writing, in both the Gospel and the book of Acts. And they tell us that if you are going to follow Jesus, you need to take the decision to follow him very seriously, right? And look, I felt a little bit of an indictment as a pastor because I'm like, do I always, when I'm helping somebody follow Jesus, do I always help them count the cost? Do I always help them take seriously, look, I'm inviting you to follow Jesus. There's people in this room who we've had those conversations, right? But there's a very real consequence of choosing Jesus. For some of us, we've experienced isolation from our families, isolation from our friends because we are walking a new type of walk. Maybe we don't hang out with the same people in the tea room because, you know, lunchtimes are just full of swearing. Like, there's a cost. Even in Melbourne today, there is a cost. And friends, we need to be prepared to make, we need to reconcile that cost in our own lives on a regular basis. But we see here that Paul had made, he had figured this thing out and he was prepared to follow. I found a few theologians and they have all comments and thoughts on what we see Luke doing here in this part of the story. They say that Luke is trying to highlight themes of sacrifice, of faithfulness, and the true cost of being a discipleship. That's from theologian Richard Purvo. Okay? He says suffering is inherent to following Jesus. Man, those are tough words. N.T. Wright, who you know that I'm a bit of a fan of, he says, as well as all of this, Luke is trying to establish that Paul was a bona fide apostle. He was somebody who indeed had been chosen by Jesus and called, and he had been sent into this work. I mean, N.T. Wright's trying to say, who would willingly walk into this if they had not been sent to do so, right? And again, there's implications for us. When we follow Jesus, would we follow him wherever he leads? Well, Paul does. N.T. Wright says that Luke is trying to undo any questions as to the authority of the Apostle Paul. This would be a gospel, I guess, a letter that would be read to future generations of the church. And if any questions into Paul's integrity would come, well, here you can see this guy was in fact the real deal. N.T. Wright also suggests that suffering, and this is something that I struggled with, guys, but suffering, the suffering of the Christian, can also ultimately lead to God being further glorified. I want to say that again. Suffering of the Christian can often lead to God being further glorified. Some of you might be new to an Adventist church, but as a denomination, we have a very strong focus on Jesus coming back and the events that surround that moment in history. And it's never a comfortable topic to, present, but, we believe that when that time comes, it's not going to be particularly nice. And one of the postures of our people has often been, well, we need to get going while the going is good, right? And there are scriptures to suggest that's something that we need to recognize. But what I see here is that, friends, it doesn't matter where we go. We can live in the country, we can live in the city. But friends, persecution comes to all of God's people. I want to read to you a quote. This is from The Great Controversy, and I'll bring that quote up. This is the end part of the quote, but I'm just going to start from the beginning. This is from the chapter, The Time of Trouble. The people of God will then be plunged into those scenes of affliction and distress described by the prophet as the time of Jacob's trouble. The assaults of Satan are fierce and determined. His delusions are terrible, but the Lord's eye is upon his people, and his ear listens to their cries. Their affliction is great. The flames of the furnace seem about to consume them, but the refiner will bring them forth as gold tried in the fire. God's love for his children during the period of their severest trials is as strong and tender as in the days of their sunniest prosperity. And we get to this quote here on the screen. But it is, watch this, guys, it is needful. She's saying this is something that Christians should experience. It is needful for them to be placed in the furnace of fire. Their earthliness must be consumed, that the image of Christ may be perfectly reflected. The founder of our denomination believed that going through hard times has a purifying effect on the individual. Going through, as Shenando says, being put in the potter's hands, it's not comfortable, but man, you get a beautiful vase at the end of it, right? You got to stick that thing in a fire. You got to put the glaze on so it bakes and the pottery dries. I mean, Christians need to go through hard times. Hopefully, we won't have to go through this exact moment, but I dare say, friends, all of us at one point or another, God will bring us through some moments where he is wanting to draw us closer to him. And if you can stick it through, man, you'll come out so much stronger for having been through it. I love what Paul says, and I just want to quote this very quickly. Philippians 1:21. For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. Man, he was living and breathing this posture. But if I'm honest, I'm very afraid of this. So my prayer for all of us is that God is building us up to a place where we could stand for him if push came to shove. But man, Paul goes through some real things. So what do we learn through Paul when he was going through some of his deepest, darkest moments? Well, what we see through this trial episode of Paul is that, in fact, he is never violating any law, both of the Jews and the Romans. He's never inciting a rebellion, which people seem to think he was, okay? But he's actually following and inviting people to follow Jesus through his deepest, darkest moments. There is this concept that perhaps you're familiar with at the time of the first century. It was called the Pax Romana. The Romans who had colonized the entire Mediterranean said, we are here to bring and enforce the Roman peace. We want to make sure that society is at equilibrium. And often the way they pursued that peace was not very good, right? But they were very serious about people who violated that peace. If you were disrupting the peace of Rome, then there were major consequences. And so Paul's big adversaries, it's mostly Jews, are trying to show him as somebody who's undermining the Roman peace. So what does he do? Well, he's being accused, even the Romans, one Roman centurion in chapter 21 goes, aren't you that Egyptian terrorist? And he goes, no, I'm not a terrorist. I'm a Roman citizen. And the guy's like, what? What I want to show you right now is that in this moment where Paul's, up against the wall, this is probably not where you're expecting this message to go, but Paul turns out to be a fantastic Roman citizen. Turns out to be a really good Roman. And you're like, okay, this message has connotations of persecution, end times, and what do we do like in that environment? Well, Luke wants you to see if, in your moment of your deepest trials, or when people are watching you and scrutinizing you, be the best Australian, Roman you can be. And I want to show you this. We probably won't be able to read all of these, but in Acts 22, verse 25, Paul is about to be, beaten up by a Roman, and he asks the guy, but when they had stretched him out for whips, Paul said to the centurion who is standing by, is it lawful for you to flog a man who is a Roman citizen and uncondemned? Paul demonstrates a working knowledge of Roman law, and he wants the Roman soldiers to uphold the standard of Roman law. He points out his citizenship. In chapter 24, we won't turn there, but chapter 24 and verse 25, you can check it out later, while he's being interviewed by Felix. He's doing these Bible studies, we're told. They're getting together regularly. In verse 26, we read that at the same time, this is Felix, hoped that money would be given to him by Paul. Luke wants you to see that Paul is a model Roman, and all of the people you would expect to be model Romans, the centurion and now the governor, are people who do not even have a respect for their own law. Luke is wanting you to see this kind of juxtaposition, right? And so we continue. We also see that while Festus is having a conversation, this is another Roman governor. Okay, we see that this phrase, serious charges have been put against him, but this guy has not violated any law against Caesar. They cannot find anything wrong with him. Okay? All right. Later on in chapter 25, verse 27, Festus, talking to Agrippa, again points out that this guy, he's a little bit unreasonable, but we still can't find anything wrong with him. King Agrippa, having heard Paul, goes, you know what? The guy's completely fine. He's a good guy. We cannot find anything wrong with him. Friends, when we are going through these moments in our lives, whether you're going through something right now, whether it's the big one that the Bible talks about or prophecy talks about, have you ever thought that it matters how you present to the world? Have you ever thought that it matters, church, that we show ourselves to be good citizens of the Cardinia Shire or the KC Shire? Have you ever thought that it matters how people perceive who you are? Yeah, that person's a kooky Christian, but he's a good member of our community. He comes and helps out on Clean Up Australia Day. When we had the fun run, he came and gave water to the kids. He volunteers at the bus at the library. I mean, yeah, they believe some weird stuff, but we can't fault them because they love our community. So many theologians I was reading, just so you cannot shake that Luke wants us to see that Paul is being a model Roman, and the Christian needs to be a model Christian wherever they find themselves. Are you a model Australian? Are you a model Christian wherever you find yourself? Are you like a Joseph who does the best work in your workplace? Do you roll up your sleeves and show that, you know what, you might not agree with me when it comes to my belief in God, but you cannot fault my values on display here? It's not probably the thing you'd expect, but friends, it's important. Time and time again, it's referenced in this story. What we see here, friends, is that Paul cares more about the legal process of the Romans than the Romans do. And he's not afraid to put that on display in front of the bigwigs as well. I want to read to you this quote from Acts of the Apostles. Christians should act as faithful, conscientious citizens, obeying the laws of the land unless they conflict with God's law. We are to recognize human governments as an ordinance of divine appointment and teach obedience to it. Teach obedience to it as sacred duty within its legitimate sphere. Have you ever thought of that? Obeying the law as a sacred duty? Has anybody ever thought of that? Me being a good Australian citizen is my sacred duty? I've never thought of that. I dare say Paul did. All right? I want to share with you another quote. This is from a theologian, Tim Mackey, and I'll get his slide up. He's a guy that I like to check out a lot. He says, Paul becomes Luke's showpiece for how Christians can discover a vocation and a calling to be change agents, but not through the normal means that we think of changing or influencing. And it's all orchestrated by God's Spirit. I want you to see that. These environments that Paul was being a good Roman on display, God had orchestrated this. Paul didn't orchestrate all the years of imprisonment, but that the imprisonment becomes a way for Paul to influence all kinds of people that he never would have come in contact with had he been out planting churches. The quote actually finishes, "It's pretty cool." Have you ever thought, maybe the hard times that I've yet to experience, maybe God's putting you into a place to be a shiny Christian? Have you thought of that? To be a model Australian. To go, hey guys, this is not the value, I'm going to be hypothetical, this is not mateship on display. Let me model mateship, because mateship's all over Scripture. You see what I'm saying? Maybe God calls us to places, He puts us in environments that we are uncomfortable with, might even be a part of this kind of crazy that's coming down the line, we're told, but maybe He's doing that to help us show people a better way. Where has He placed you now? And what do people think of Christians? What do they think of you as an Australian? Somebody who loves this country? I'm not here to get all what's the word? Patriotic. I was going to say patriarchal. That's the wrong word. Patriotic. But I think there's a clear spiritual principle here. We are called to be good citizens of this country. And friends, Adra does a lot to help lift the profile of this church. Let me just tell you that. We ride off the coattails of what Adra does. But wouldn't it be great if more of our members could not just go to Adra, but wherever you find yourself, really just find yourself helping lift the profile of this expression of Jesus? Wouldn't that be incredible? I had a conversation with Beck Orient, our ADRA leader, and she doesn't know that we are planning to build a new church, but she said, Ryan, you know what? The council has told me they are looking for car parks. What are they looking for car parks, Beck? They're looking for car parks because there are so many homeless women in this community, and they just need a safe place to sleep. And if, they just want somebody to man a car park which has a gate that can be closed, and women and their children can drive their cars in and just sleep the night in their cars safely. It's like, wouldn't that be great if our church had a place like that women could come and have a sleep? And I was thinking, well, we're building a building. Wouldn't that be cool? I'm not saying it's something we should do. But friends, imagine the profile of our church. I'm not trying to say we're doing this to be a shiny star, but if we are here to say, we are here to support the homeless women in this shire with our car park. I meet with the pastors regularly of this shire, the Anglicans, Pastor Richard, who meets here on a Sunday, the Baptists, the House Church Network, just a few streets back from here. And we always talk about how the council is at odds with the Christian church here. But has the Christian church done anything to show that we are for the community? It's a question we need to ask. But friends, there are ways we can do it. Some food for thought. So what we see is in Paul, in his sort of dark moments, he becomes a model Roman. But he also speaks model words. And you might remember I had a little phrase highlighted in blue a few slides back, and it's what I want to focus on. We looked at the similarities between Jesus and Paul, but there's one similarity. They both make reference of the resurrection. Paul will go in front of Jews and Gentiles, important people, really important people, and the one commonality, and we could look at all sorts of different ideas that come out of these defenses that he gives, but the one common thing that you see in all of these settings is that he makes a reference to the resurrection of Jesus. That was something I wasn't really expecting to see, but it is the common thread in all of these stories. Paul will, the Greek word is, he will do a defense, and the word is apologiomai. It's where we get our word apologetics. It's a branch of theology where apologetics, you defend the faith, okay? So Paul will use this apologiomai. And here on this slide are the 4 things he'll talk about. And all of these things are in different settings, but they paint one message. And it's a powerful message. I just want to quickly mention each of these verses. In the first passage, Acts 23, Paul will make a defense to the Jews. And he knows that it's a little bit divisive, but he says to the Roman present in the room, look, I'm on trial because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead. It's very divisive because Sadducees just believe in this life and then that's it. No miracles, nothing, just this life and then that's it. The whole room goes crazy after that. But Paul says, I'm on trial because of the hope of the resurrection. In Acts 24, when he starts to talk to Felix, in chapter 24, verse 15, he says, having a hope in God, which these men themselves accept, and this was our passage, thank you, Auntie Nora, that there will be a resurrection of both just and the unjust. So we add a little bit more. First, we've seen that he's on trial because of the hope of the resurrection. Secondly, we see that there is a resurrection of the just and the unjust. Does this sound like Adventist theology? Yes, I got really excited, guys. Acts 25, when Festus starts to explain to King Agrippa what Paul has said, he says in verse 19, rather they had certain points of dispute, Paul and the Jews, with him about their own religion and about a certain Jesus who was dead, but whom Paul asserted to be alive. So we start to expand this a little bit more. We'll bring it all together. And then finally in Acts chapter 26, when Paul himself talks to King Agrippa, he starts to share in verse 23 that the Christ must suffer, and that by being the first to rise from the dead, he would proclaim light both to our people and to the Gentiles. Now let's go back to that slide that I had, guys. But if we just lay all of the things that Paul says, you see a well-developed theology. Just have a look. The first thing he says, it is with respect to the hope of the resurrection of the dead that I'm on trial. So he goes, there's this resurrection that's coming. There'll be a resurrection, the second thing, of the just and the unjust. And then he says the reason why we can have this resurrection is because Jesus, who was dead, is now alive. Amen? Amen. And then finally he says Christ was the first to rise from the dead. This is Pauline theology at its core. Paul's theology is all about new creation. We talked about this in our Luke series. But Luke wants you to see that Paul is all about a new creation happening. And the teaching of the state of the dead, of we die, but one day Jesus is coming to resurrect us. Man, that is the ultimate expression of new creation. And it doesn't matter wherever Paul goes. It doesn't matter if he's talking to a Jew. It doesn't matter if he's talking to a Gentile. He will talk about Christ and him crucified, but he will ultimately tie in the resurrection. For Paul, apologetics is all about talking about the resurrection. Without the resurrection, we have nothing. And so to anybody who has a listening ear, he will defend himself, but whilst he's defending himself, he will weave in. Guys, central to my message is that Jesus is alive. And it gives me a hope. Are you ready for when he comes back? You know, we are all going to die, but there's going to be a judgment of the righteous. There's going to be a judgment of the wicked. Where are you going to stand in that? This Jesus is Lord. How do you relate to him? Is he your Lord or is Caesar Lord? I don't care if you're the governor of Judea or if you're a Jewish Sadducee. You need to know that Jesus is alive, and once he was dead. But friends, if Jesus is alive, it changes everything. Now, I was looking at this and I'm like, man, Paul is consistent. And we love to study, I love to study all of the best ways to share faith. But Paul's consistent thing is bring up the resurrection. If they can agree that Jesus is alive, then you've got a lot of things to wrestle with, don't you? If you believe that Jesus is a historical figure, yes, he lived a good life and this and that and the other, but the story goes he dies and comes back again. If you're talking to your cousin who doesn't believe in Jesus, goes, look, mate, if Jesus did come back to life, doesn't that change everything? It's such an important point. And I just saw this and I'm like, Luke wants us to see this. This is so important to share in whatever setting we find ourselves. I want to read you our final slide for today, and then I'll finish with an Ellen White quote. But this is Andy Stanley. He's a very popular pastor in America. I don't agree with everything that he does, but this was a very controversial thing that he said. I want to read you what he said. Christianity doesn't hang by the thread of the Bible tells me so. That's the thing that got him in trouble. He says Christianity, it's not based firstly and foremostly on the Bible. I think that's what he should have said. The way he said it, a lot of pastors and theologians, myself included, we all got hot under the collar. Like, this guy's saying the Bible's not important. It's actually not what he was saying. What he was trying to say is, what is the thing that the Christian experience rests on? He says it hangs by the thread of Jesus rose from the dead. The foundation of our faith is not an inspired book, it's an event. Friends, if Jesus, he lived, he did 3.5 years of incredible ministry, but if he dies and doesn't come back to life, what's the point? What's the point? You can have all of these wonderful prophecies that are foretelling a Messiah. You know, Isaiah 52, he'll be led like a lamb to the slaughter. Great. And he stayed dead. What's the point? That's what he's trying to say. And I think people, he kind of got a bit too focused on one thing and not the other. I think they both go hand in hand. But I still like to agree with this. If Jesus doesn't rise, what do we have? Do we have a blessed hope as Seventh-day Adventists, right? Do we have a hope of the resurrection? Do we have a hope of the second coming? Who's coming? Jesus isn't coming if he doesn't rise from the dead. So much of our faith rests on Jesus coming back to life. So I want to finish on this quote, and then we'll end with our song. This is again from one of our founders, from Acts of the Apostle. Christ's resurrection is the pledge of the resurrection of all his people. For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so, them also which sleep in Jesus will God bring with him. Friends, this crazy season of Paul's life, when Paul's under the pump, he's under pressure, he shows us what it looks like to be a model citizen. But he shows us what to say. And friends, maybe some of the easiest conversations we can have with the people in our lives are go, look, it's Christmas, and we're here as a family, but I know you think I'm a weird as a Christian, but if Jesus came back to life, I just want you to think, what does that change? That one question alone will send people into sleepless nights. I want to invite our worship team up. We have such a simple tool, and it's to share that Jesus is risen.